Well, thank you everyone for joining. I think very excited to kick the session off. And two things to note. I think there's a lot of topics that we're going to cover. I think the purpose of this is to share this knowledge, and I find that the best discussions are ones where, if there are topics, there's questions we want to dive deeper into, the more that we can make this a little bit of a dialogue. We're going to do our best to kind of constantly monitor the chat and engage. And furthermore, there's a ton of experts that are on this call, and great sales comp leaders that are part of this community. And so I feel like the more that we can have a dynamic discussion on the topics, the better. But just to kick us off, very high level intro. The way I'd like to describe it is we're a bunch of ex-consultants that work in sales performance management, and decided that there's a different way that we wanted to approach it. And so that's my background. I worked in consulting in the space of sales compensation, territory, quota setting, and beyond. And I left to found Forma in 2016. And with that, I'll pass it over to Kyle to the introduction.
Yeah, hi everyone. Really looking forward to the session today. I'm Kyle Webster. I'm the chief of staff at Forma. I spent the last 10 years or so in sales comp, like Nabil. Spent the first half or so in management consulting, working primarily with organizations on sales comp strategy and design across a wide array of industries. I really enjoyed presenting the 101 session we did about a month ago, and yeah, looking forward to diving into some of the more advanced topics today in 201.
Yep, I guess I'll go next. It's Elliot Offit, so I'm our VP of Implementation and Onboarding. Been in the space for a number of years, kind of a mix, half and half, between consulting around Salesforce effectiveness and those topic areas, and then also doing implementation leadership across a number of different tech platforms in this space. So looking forward to chatting with everybody here for a bit.
And my name is David Girardi. Similar to Elliot and Kyle, again, spent first half of my career in consulting, focusing in the SPM space, mostly in incentive comp design, but also focusing on things like segmentation, Salesforce sizing, and targeting. And then the second half of my career before joining Forma was on the client side, doing corporate strategy. And I've been leading the operations team here at Forma for the past few years.
Perfect. So just to dive right in, when we think about what best-in-class effectiveness measurement is, or best-in-class sales performance management, I think if I had to summarize it very quickly, it's proactive, it's real time, and it takes us out of the old mindset of a point in time, one-off type of analysis, and then letting that roll out until 4 years later, when it's so broken that we have to go back in. And this is ultimately what I saw when in the world of consulting, was that we would do these amazing analyses, very logical frameworks that would produce great outcomes, but they were very point in time. Even the data inputs, by the time we actually produced the results, in some cases, the data that was feeding into these was starting to be a bit more stale by the time we got the results. And so the way to think about moving towards that best in class is building these frameworks into the day-to-day operations and processes that we build, and how we manage our sales compensation, our broader go-to-market execution function. And so, the series that we're putting on now, if we recall back to the 101 session, is really a very high-level introductory overview of kind of some of the fundamental frameworks on analyzing, specifically a bit more on the quota and sales performance, sales incentive side. And now we want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the analytics to better understand how it connects broader sales performance with sales compensation. And our goal is in sharing these frameworks that these are things that become embedded and incorporated within everyone's process, and is not something that is, these frameworks are not guarded behind any sort of one-off engagements type thing. So just to dive in, if we go to the next slide here, Elliot, I want to serve up the high level approach that we think about when we think about sales performance management. So at the end of the day, in the go-to-market function, we are trying to understand the potential, the opportunity that we're going to capture. We are trying to understand the behaviors that best enable us to capture that potential. And then we are trying to understand the incentives and the performance management, the coaching, the infrastructure to enable that organization to be motivated and execute on those behaviors to help us capture that potential. And so it really is way more than just incentives, of course. It's about bridging our understanding of the customer and the market, the potential, and what needs to be done to capture that with how we guide and motivate a sales team to do so. And so as we dive into the session, if we go to the next slide here, Elliot, as we dive into the session, we're going to focus a little bit more on that upstream side, because in the previous session on 101, we covered the fundamentals of some of the fundamental analyses that you're going to use to look at how effective your comp plan strategy is in terms of quota setting and the effectiveness of that, any biases, any indicators that there's something off, our pay curve, our differentiation across lower to bottom to higher performing reps through paid composition, and the cost of sales analysis. These are all great in terms of letting you know if the end result is producing what you're looking for. But to really go that step further and be more proactive, we want to take a look at and bridge the incentives, the behaviors with the potential and the customer outcome. And so as we dive into today's session in 201, we're going to be covering 3 things today. We're going to dive into the cost modeling with Monte-carlo simulations. At the end of the day, what Kyle's going to walk us through in this section is how to best set up a process to understand the cost and simulate the potential outcomes of our comp structures so that we have a more accurate prediction, which ultimately unlocks budget for us for how we want to spend and use that money from a sales compensation perspective. The second thing we're going to walk to is the performance correlation analysis. And Dave Jardy is going to walk us through this to help us bridge the gap in understanding, are we actually even applying motivating the right behaviors? Do we understand the things that our sales team does that actually produce a better outcome? And how do we tie that back to understanding how we want to design the behavioral motivations in a comp plan to capitalize on that opportunity? And then the third section that Elliot will be walking us through is territory fairness and workload indexing. And so this is about better understanding the customers, the potential within a territory, and balancing that out so that we maximize our coverage and our use of the go-to-market resources. So as I said earlier, the more we can make this dynamic, there's a ton of experts on the call that I'm really excited to kind of see how everyone has different perspectives or seen any of these initiatives or frameworks work. And the more of a broader discussion that we can have, I think the more productive this will be. But with that, I'll pass it over to Kyle to kick us off.
Sounds good. Okay, so like Nabil mentioned, we're going to start off today with using Monte-carlo simulations to more accurately budget and forecast sales comp spend. So before we get into Monte-carlo specifically, let's level set on why this is important and why this is a problem that we're solving for. So why is it important? This one's pretty straightforward. Incentive comp represents a huge cost line item for most B2B organizations. And then you combine that with the fact that it's extremely variable with complex mechanics that are actually driving the cost outcome. And so Elliot, if you want to tab forward and bring up the visual, the variability and complexity is why a lot of organizations struggle with accurately budgeting for sales comp spend, because at the end of the day, it's not everyone gets 5% commission rate on sales and there you go, that's our budget. We're contending with a complex system where we might have 50 different roles, 100 different comp plans, each with their own mechanics, and we have thousands of sellers, each that has their own quota and target earnings, and how each of them is actually going to perform is going to vary. And so there isn't just one possible outcome that can occur. An organization might have a $100 million revenue target, but across all those sales teams and reps and plans, there's a lot of different ways to get to the 100 million with different sales comp costs. And this is why getting sales comp budgeting right can be really hard. And so, when we think about the approaches that organizations take today to budget for sales comp, it can range from, very simple, like, we assume, everyone just comes in at target, to, running a handful of different performance scenarios, to more sophisticated approaches like we're going to walk through today. And obviously, the impact of getting sales comp budgets wrong is huge. On more than one occasion, I've seen this become a C-level and a board level issue. Just because the simplistic approaches can leave a lot of room for error. So if we want to jump to the next slide, we'll start at kind of the highest level. What is Monte-Carlo simulation? So it's a statistical approach. It's been around since about the 40s. It's named after the famous casino in Monaco because of its use of probability and chance in the model. And it has actually a really wide array of use cases in business and beyond, from forecasting stock prices to modeling pharmaceutical drug development processes. And I've got, a definition from how, AWS describes it up on the slide here. It's a mathematical technique that predicts possible outcomes of an uncertain event. It uses computer system to run enough simulations to produce different outcomes that mimic real life results. And so, in our case, sales team performance and sales comp spend is the uncertain event. So in other words, what a Monte-Carlo analysis lets us do is, instead of just running one static calculation, what would we spend if everyone had the same performance as last year? Instead, we're able to simulate and iterate through thousands and thousands of different performance scenarios so that we can understand which ones are the most likely to occur and what the associated cost and sales comp budget should be. And so I know this is a little bit abstract and technical, so we're going to unpack this a little bit and dive down into how it actually works. So let's start here with what your average organization might create in terms of a sales comp budget. And so just to set the stage in terms of what we're looking at on the slide, we're basically showing a cumulative sales comp budget for the year. So on the vertical axis, we've got total sales comp spend, and horizontally, we're breaking it out by month. And the purple line represents the budget. So the way to read this would be that, in January, we're expecting to have spent just under 500K on commissions. And by the end of the year, we're going to spend, a bit under 4.5 million. We've got some seasonality in there. It's kind of flatter through the summer, and things pick up towards the end of the year as people get into accelerators. But this is one single static scenario. So to actually produce this line, again, we might have assumed here that, all of our reps are going to come in right at quota. But again, what this line represents is one scenario based on one set of assumptions. And so what a lot of organizations will do, if we go to the next slide, is we'll run a few different potential scenarios. So, what happens if we overperform revenue target by 5%, or if we underperform by 5%? And so we'll have a few potential scenarios that we can present to finance. And again, that's what you have up on the slide right now. So we have a few kind of hand-picked static scenarios, but what we really haven't solved for is understanding, again, all that variability that can occur across our thousands of different sellers on different plans in different regions. And so if we go to the next slide, what a Monte-Carlo simulation will allow us to do is simulate and run thousands and thousands of different sales team performance and resultant sales comp cost scenarios. So on the slide here, each of these lines represents a single simulation of sales team performance, all the way down to a rep metric level. And then we use that to create each of the budget lines. So in theory, what we're doing is we're running, so many different scenarios that we're effectively capturing all possible outcomes. And then we can use these scenarios for a couple of different things. The first is that we can use them to create a more accurate budget, which we'll go through on the next slide in just a second. And the other thing is it'll give me visibility to if my plans might end up creating cost outcomes that I'm not expecting. Like, I can search all of my scenarios that I've produced and see things like, is it possible for the organization to come in, 10% below revenue target, but still exceed budget on commissions, which obviously wouldn't be a good outcome. And, how likely is that to occur, which can then help us tweak incentive plans as we're modeling them. And so if you want to go to the next slide, what we can then do is summarize all these observations into a single budget output. And that's what you're looking at on the slide right now. This is what the final output of a Monte-Carlo sales comp budget might look like. And just to walk through this in a little bit more detail, the solid line here, the solid purple line, represents our actual budget for the year. But instead of being the result of just one single scenario, it's going to be the average of our thousands of simulations that meet whatever criteria that we want to specify. So taking all of the simulations where the company comes in at 100% of revenue target and consolidating that down into our budget. And then because we have these thousands of scenarios, we're able to understand the probability of any specific cost outcome occurring. And so that's what these dashed lines represent. And I won't go super deep on this, but the light purple is basically one standard deviation out from our budget. The gray is 2. So the way to read this is, our full year budget is 4.1 million. That's what we're forecasting. And then the area within the dashed purple lines, based on all the simulations we ran, we can say that there's a 68% probability that our spend will land somewhere between those lines, so between 3.9 and 4.3 million. So effectively, what this means is we can provide finance with both a budget, but also the potential range that could occur and the probability of that range actually happening. And then, of course, we're able to track this throughout the year, which is what the blue line running through up till April represents. So this is kind of what the high level output looks like. And just, to make this a little bit more real, I've seen organizations go from double-digit percentage budget overages to within 1% accuracy on the year, and using it as part of their cost modeling process during their design and planning phase to better understand financial risk and update plans accordingly. So this is what the output of a Monte-Carlo simulation budget looks like. Again, I realize this might be a little bit abstract, so we're going to go one level deeper to really explain, how you would run one of these more tactically, as if you were doing it in a spreadsheet to try to kind of bring it all together. And so that's basically what you've got on the slide here. So let's take a look at the table on the left of the slide, and let's think of this analysis as though it's literally it's in a spreadsheet. We're going to walk through effectively the world's simplest Monte-Carlo setup here. So the way to look at this, let's say I have 5 sales reps, as you can see listed in the first column. Each one of these reps has a single fixed commission rate, which is the second column. And this ranges anywhere from 2% to 9% of sales. And then what we have in the third column is revenue, and the fourth column is commissions. So the commission rate multiplied by revenue. But the way we would set this up is that the revenue is a simulated value. So what I'm doing here in the model is that I'm simulating revenue performance across these 5 sales reps based on some predefined inputs into the model. And so that's what you have on the right side of the slide here. So, I might have looked at last year's data and said, okay, I'm going to assume that we have a bell-shaped performance distribution that's centered around, 700K in revenue. So in the model, I'm not defining the exact revenue amount that each of the sales reps is going to get, but I'm defining the parameters for the model to simulate the revenue across my employee population. And then so, Elliot, if you want to tab through, every time I refresh the model, I'm going to get a new scenario of revenue results and a new scenario for commissions, which again is the commission rate multiplied by the simulation revenue. So I could run this, 1,000 times, and that's what I would use to create the chart that we just looked at on the last slide, which was the final output. And so, basically what you can see is that even just in these 3 scenarios that we've run here, each one of those scenarios, they came in at about the exact same amount of revenue, just over 4 million. But there are actually pretty big swings in the simulated commissions based on who overperformed and who underperformed, given we had a big range in commission rates. And this is why a Monte-Carlo analysis is a really good approach for sales comp, because obviously most organizations have way more than 5 salespeople, way more complicated plan mechanics, and we're able to better capture the different possible cost outcomes and create more accurate budgets and forecasts. And then if we just want to jump to the last slide here, this is really just to wrap it up. So again, a Monte-Carlo simulation for budgeting, it's going to allow us to set more accurate sales comp budgets at the beginning of the year, taking into account more scenarios than you'd be able to with more traditional approaches. It allows us to understand and visualize the likelihood of different cost scenarios occurring. It can help us better model plans during the design process, understanding the cost impact of new metrics or changes to mechanics. And finally, it can help us reforecast better throughout the year. So it doesn't really have to stop at when the original budget is set. Each month, we can bring in our actuals and then reforecast out the remainder of the year based on updated revenue forecasts from the business. And then just the last thing I'll call out before I wrap it up here is, really what can be unlocked as a sales comp team when we're super confident in the accuracy of our spend forecast, because it can actually let us get a little bit more aggressive with plan design, in an effort to, at the end of the day, drive incremental revenue. If we think we have a really solid forecast, we might be more comfortable going a little bit more aggressive on that accelerator for that new product. Or, if we're tracking a little bit below budget, we might be confident enough to redeploy some of that gap to rolling out a new spiff to drive incremental performance. Whereas, if we weren't as confident in the forecast, we might take a little bit of a wait and see approach and forgo that spiff or that increase in accelerator. So that's really all I had in terms of content for this section. If there's anything else the Forma team wants to add, please jump in, and then we can transition to questions for a sec.
Yeah, the one thing that just and I think the question that's came up in the chat as well. So hopefully this will cover it. So Monte-carlo simulation is a very it's a pretty blunt force instrument that can be refined depending on how you apply it. So what I mean by that is you can just do a very simple, randomization of attainment at a rep level and produce an outcome. And that's going to get you initial result that might look like the outputs that we're looking at here. And you build that as version 1. And then in version 2 or 3, as you kind of expand on it, the goal is to basically start running there's 2 ways that you can make it more advanced. You can add incremental areas where you are using a probability curve to determine the outcomes, or you add incremental stages in your process. Sorry, let me just back and clarify. So instead of just looking at overall attainment, what we may want to do is then get down to a level of specific metrics within a comp plan. So it's not just overall pay curve attainment, but it's actually specific measures within the comp plan that we want to test. Or taking it 2 steps further, you can actually do the modeling for the Monte-carlo, like the simulations, at an account level or at the granularity of account month level. And the more and more variables that we apply into this scenario, into the simulation model, the more predictive this outcome will be. And if you think about it, kind of like that future state where you're able to, kind of build this model to predict within, plus or minus 0.1%, versus plus or minus 1%, at all different stages of performance, all you're doing is just adding incremental variables that you're testing and iterating on. And so it doesn't have to start that sophisticated. You can start relatively straightforward and simple as Kyle's defined. And then the more and more you expand on the model, the more sophisticated it can become.
All right. Any other comments, or we can jump to the next section here? Thanks, Nabil. Okay.
All right. So I'm going to talk about performance correlation analysis. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to set the stage for what this is and provide everyone a bit of a refresher, because I feel like this is first probably introduced to all of us back in high school. We take it again in university, college, and who knows how much we really remember at this stage. So I want to paint the picture of essentially how it impacts our comp plan. So if we take a first step of saying the objective of the comp plan is to design incentives that drive actual rep behavior. So there's one thing to say, we want our retention reps to go after renewals, and maybe measuring on renewals is a great thing to do. But essentially what we're trying to do is figure out what is the actual behavior that drives those renewals, and is there a way we can uncover that through some sort of analysis. So it's about connecting the behavior to the business outcome. That is the real key here. And essentially regression modeling can help us understand and quantify that connection between outcome and behavior. So if we go to the next slide, just as, again, setting the stage, is a regression model. What is it? It's a model. If we look at a univariate model, essentially one variable predicting another, it basically explains the relationship between two or more variables. And so the line of best fit that we would draw through looking at two variables, as you can see on the right-hand side, is essentially showing you how much variance that one variable can explain in the other. And subsequently, the R-squared value that I'm sure we all remember from ages ago, that is essentially quantifying how much variance. So in other words, in the model on the right, or the scatter plot on the right, we can see that quota attainment is being plotted against the payout percentage of all the reps in our sales force. And we draw the line of best fit, and we notice that the R-squared value is 0.514, which is essentially saying that quota attainment is explaining 51.4% of the variance in the payout for our reps. So that's essentially what we get when we do a simple univariate, which is one variable predicting another, scatter plot, which is easily done in something like Excel. So that kind of sets the stage. If we go to the next slide, things that we should remember when we're doing this is that, the benefits of it is that it's really quick and easy to compute, and it's a good way to determine kind of how one variable impacts another, kind of in a rough and dirty way. We also have to remember that there's no real hard rule on interpreting the R-squared value in terms of saying what is good or bad. So we could look at the top graph and say 51.4%. We can say that is great because it's over 50 if maybe that's our cutoff. But essentially, we have to keep in mind that there are certain fields. As an example, I know from like psychology, we can in certain fields like psychology, getting an R-squared value of 0.2 would be outstanding, right? Because there's certain things that occur in the world that we all live in that are just inherently more muddy. There's more noise around the actual signal. And so it comes with kind of experience and working with data to understand when you're seeing something that actually makes sense, or something that you have, you can put reliability behind. And the last comment I want to make, that there's a difference in what we're looking at here in terms of using the R-squared value and interpreting a value of 51% and saying that's good or bad, in terms of asking yourself, does a relationship between these two variables exist? Or are we trying to use that model to make a prediction? So as an example, in the top graph, I might not want to grab someone's quota attainment and use this model to predict how much payout they're going to get based on that line of best fit. However, I can probably reliably say that getting a high quota attainment is correlated with getting a high payout. So that's a very important distinction to make. Okay, so going on to the next slide, if we go forward one, I want to make sure the other thing to remember is that something we all learn is correlation is not causation. So in this graph, what I've done is I've taken the previous one, what was payout percent of OTE on the y-axis, and the x-axis was quota attainment, and now I've replaced it with the height of the sales rep. So let's pretend that we've actually done this for our sales force, and we've noticed a correlation between rep height and payout percent. So the takeaway here is that it doesn't tell you actually anything about what's causing the relationship between the two variables. It's just telling you that there is some variance being explained. And so the important takeaway here is that I don't think looking at this graph and looking at an R-squared of 0.514 tells me I should go out and start hiring 6-foot sales reps, right? There's probably some sort of other behavior that is explaining this, and this is purely coincidence, and I shouldn't actually take action. So there has to be a follow-up when you're doing a regression analysis to say, does this make intuitive sense, and can I explain the behavior I'm seeing? So I want to say that the step one is creating the regression model. So this is a very important thing, but it's really the follow-up that can cover important insights. And so what we're starting with here on the slide is the same quota attainment to payout percent of OTE R squared. And then this is a bit of a callback to the 101 session of we can then expand and use our payout composition by different earnings levels and start to dig in to understand, okay, there is a correlation here. What is really weighing down those people in the lower quartiles of my scatter plot on the left-hand side? Okay, well, when I zoom in on the right-hand side, I notice that if I look at where their payout's coming from, I actually notice something even more insightful, which is that it seems in this comp plan, it's the team components that are really driving the payout for my poorer reps, right? And so essentially the takeaway is that those reps are being subsidized by high-performing reps through other components, which could lead me to some subsequent action. Going back to my first point of saying connect behavior to outcome is that, is this the actual outcome that we want with these reps? Do we want the lower performing reps receiving this payout and perhaps demotivating the higher performing reps? So on the next slide, we expand on this a little bit further and say, you can also take these insights and go dig even deeper and say, okay, let me look at my high earners, my best performing reps, my reps in quartile 4. And I can start looking at regression models on what these people, what their behaviors are, and whether or not I am seeing a correlation between that and business outcomes. So essentially, are they selling multi-year deals? Do they sell particular products that the other reps don't sell? Do their customers issue higher NPS scores? And it's important to know as well, we don't need to limit ourselves to anything that is sales related in terms of metrics. We can look at behavior-based things like booked meetings, call frequencies, et cetera. So the regressions are not, again, you can be very liberal with what you are investigating. It's just a matter of running them over and over again and making different hypotheses and seeing what the data shows.
Yeah, actually, on that point, David, I think like if you set yourself up to be able to dynamically pull as much data as possible into whatever system you're using to do this type of analysis, you almost want to just look at the correlations in metrics that you would not have normally pushed yourself to look in to see if there are any trends or indicators that are worth diving deeper into.
Yep. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Again, this is a little bit of a small illustration of a case study, but essentially we want to demonstrate how it can help inform the actual design of your comp plan. So, the situation here is a client's renewal rates are consistently below target. They're wanting to understand, how do we boost renewals and incentivize our reps to do so? And so looking at regression modeling, we can see here in the graph on the right, if we plot essentially the renewal percentage of every territory and then the professional services revenue in the 2 years prior to their renewal, we see a very strong relationship between those variables, which suggests that an important thing for renewing is whether or not they buy this particular element of a service offering. And so the outcome of that is saying, well, let's look at our comp plan. If our comp plan is just incentivizing reps based on renewals, it's probably not drilling down to tell them what behavior they should take to actually perform. And so in this case, the outcome is that let's add in some sort of metric on professional services to the comp plan and get those reps to be trying to drive that behavior, which will subsequently drive renewals as well. So just one example, just wanted to paint a picture of how this can kind of lead to that end point of how does it impact my comp plan? And then lastly, I wanted to touch on one thing that we won't go into too deeply, especially in this session, but the more powerful thing that we can do is essentially extend this to a multivariate regression. There's different techniques. You can do MLR, multiple linear regression. You can do principal component analysis, which is something I have on the right-hand side here. But essentially, it's looking at all of the variables together to see how their correlation in tandem explains the variance in data. So as an example, you could run a regression on product A and retention and say, oh, there is a relationship here, so product A is great. You could do it individually on product B, on product C, on call frequency, all sorts of different variables. But what might be important is how those variables are working together, and instead of working individually, that can drive further insights into how your sales force is behaving. So in the example I have here, and I won't go into how to interpret a loadings plot, and this could be a future session, but essentially you could say that it's actually the combinations of multiple products that is unlocking the renewal probability for your customers, rather than just saying, oh, I'm just going to incentivize them on product A and product C individually. Maybe it's a combo sale that we want to drive at. So again, we can probably touch on this in a future session, but essentially, it's great to look at everything as a starting point in terms of a univariate way, but there is a whole new universe out there and in the research community with multivariate regression as well. And I'll end there.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Dave. So we have a few questions kind of trickling, and I think what we'll do is I'll run through this next section, but keep the questions coming. I'll run through this next section on balancing territories with the workload index, and then we should have a few minutes here at the end. We can speak to any questions that come up through the Q&A. So thanks for everybody participating. Okay, so to bring up the end of the session here with balancing territories, not as math heavy, so you can take a breath if you're trying to follow along with Kyle's Monte-carlo simulation and Dave's regression analysis. Those are a little heavier quantitative topics. This one is really more about a process that can be used to ultimately land on balanced territories for your sales team. So just a few slides that I'm going to cover. I'll spend a little time here walking through some key points on these. So, I'm going to get into what territory indexing is and explain the process of how you get through that. But why it's ultimately really important is that when this process is done correctly, you'll land on territories that the sales organization is generally going to agree are fair and equitable across the team. And if that perception propagates its way down to your reps, that's fantastic, because then you'll have, presumably it's going to be positive for morale and just generally, believing that the management of the sales team is behind setting up a level playing field for all of the sales reps to go out and achieve and hit their objectives and their quota ultimately. So that being said, I'll jump into some of the details here. This first page is really about the data, because that's what makes this kind of this process, I'll call it, really not as much analysis, but process, more challenging. So what we're doing with territory indexing is taking an analytical technique and assigning a relative value to your territories based on quantitative measures of workload and or sales potential. Typically, and I've done this a number of times as a consultant, and I think everybody on this call probably has at some point in their career, but you want to balance workload and sales potential. So I'll talk about that a little bit, but it's not a requirement. You could do this exercise only looking at workload for your territories and trying to balance workload. You could also just do it looking at sales potential, but ideally you have metrics that will support both of those, and then the technique we'll go through shows you how to blend them together and come out with balanced territories. But to spend a couple of minutes on the key data here, because this is what drives the whole process or the whole analysis, is first territory workload. So the idea here is that there's some amount of work required to cover accounts, right, that the sales reps are going to have to go through and time consume to do this work. And we want to try to allocate this workload evenly across all the territories, right? Distribute that workload as evenly as possible. So to do that, you have to have some metric that will tell you an approximation of what workload is. So probably the most simplistic way to think about this is just number of accounts, but that may not work very well, right? In some environments, if you have a sales activity that is very consistent, one account to the next, the next, the next, right? Simplest example would be like some kind of door-to-door sales. Then sure, number of accounts is fine because every account kind of has equal weight as far as representing territory workload or rolling up to a territory workload. The second one, accounts by segment, that's the technique we would use the most when I do this work in consulting. It's essentially segmenting your customers out, and then for each of those segments, deciding a customer in that segment is approximately X amount of work. And then you can combine those numbers and you can say, and for any given territory, there's going to be a total workload number, which is what we need to be able to come up with to do the analysis that I'll get to here on the next page. So accounts by segment is a pretty common approach. The other one, and several of us here kind of did this in pharma early in our careers, it could be geographic, right? It could be if the rep's workload is really driven primarily by actually being on the road and going from account to account, you may look at some kind of geographic dispersion of the accounts to approximate workload. A very sparsely populated account is going to be more workload than like Manhattan and New York City is generally going to be your most dense workload because you're literally walking building to building to do account coverage. So anyways, first part of this is finding a metric that's a good representation of workload for the sales rep. Okay, the right-hand side, the other piece of this is understanding potential territory sales, or I bucketed this with actual sales. They're a little bit different, but in some cases, if you didn't have a good metric to use, you might just use historical sales or actual sales. I'll talk a little bit about using three, basically workload, territory sale, potential sales, and actuals as a way to go through the process. But the key point here is really potential territory sales. So again, if you had a magic number that said our total addressable market is X, then you simply need to find a way to allocate that total addressable market across the territories, or really across the accounts that roll up to the territories. In some organizations, you may have that. You may have an analytics group that does a lot of work around understanding total addressable market. More commonly, what I've seen in most B2B environments is that you don't necessarily have that number readily available, but you know roughly like what the penetrated accounts are, how much you've sold into those accounts. And from that, you can derive, well, if there's a key metric like number of employees, number of rooms, if you're talking about hotels, number of beds, maybe in a hospital. If you're selling to companies that have fleets of vehicles and the number of vehicles matters, maybe number of vehicles in the fleet. Could be many, many possibilities here as far as the underlying metric you use, but you look at a sample of accounts that are highly penetrated and ratio it with that key metric, rooms, beds, vehicles, etc. And then you can apply that to your entire universe of accounts and understand what the potential of each one of those accounts would be. And I say accounts and geos interchangeably because in some scenarios it's really a geographic alignment, in others it's account based. So take that. I'll try to remind you all when we get to that where it matters. But the point is that you're coming up with a way to estimate the sales potential at that granular level, called account level or geography level, that you can then roll up to a territory. Okay, so the underlying data is what's really important here. And then the other piece is that this data changes over time. So when you do this as a one-time effort, time passes and then that database you built, if there's no process behind keeping that data up to date, it becomes kind of obsolete and you have to go through this whole process again. So ideally you're putting it in a system that is maintained so you always have decent potential sales data and workload data available. Okay, so that being said, that's kind of the underlying data we're talking about when we get to the next page here. And I can actually, I'm clicking so I can use the mouse. So the steps to go through calculating a territory index. This is just kind of the mechanics of how you do the work. So I'll walk through it sort of step by step here. And again, the end goal, we'll come back to that on the next page, is to get to balanced territories. But the steps are actually really simple. The math here is not all that hard. So if we start on the left-hand side, top left with step one, it's essentially very similar to Kyle's Monte-carlo. I'm using a very simple example of 3 territories, but theoretically you'd have as many territories as you need. It could be hundreds, could be in the thousands potentially, but a very large number of territories. And you have this metric that I was just talking about for workload, sales potential, and historical sales, that the key thing with this analysis or this process is that you have to have that data at the account level so you can roll it up to the territory. So if we have that data, then we can assign a value for each of these metrics to each of our territories. So step one is just assigning that data, summing it up at the territory level, and then you take an average across all the territories. So with this very simple example, the average workload is 50, the average sales potential 217, and the average sales is 55. Okay, so very simple math there. Again, the data is the hard part, having all your data lined up to sum it to the territory level. So once you take the average, the next step is simply to create, the first step index. I like to use 1,000, and that's what a lot of us used in the past. To do this, you could index off one. It's really kind of arbitrary, but 1,000 is just easier. The numbers are easier to think about once you're getting to the iterative step at the end. So anyways, you build an index simply by dividing the value for each of your territories by the average. So with territory 1 in this example, its value was 50 in step 1. The workload value was 50, and that's our average. So it's a 1. It gets a score of 1 for workload. So it's your very average workload territory. Territory 2 is was 75 on workload in step 1, and so it's 50% more, so it's 1.5. And similarly, territory 3 was less, so it's 0.5, and so on. Same thing with potential. You divide them by your average. You can see where your highest and lowest potential are, and then same thing with the actual sales, the historical sales in that territory. So you can see where these numbers fall out. So the process we would go through, or the next step we would go through to make these easier to kind of get our heads around, is simply multiply this number by 1,000, and then we apply a weighting. Okay, and then once we apply the weighting, we can sum them up and jump to an index number. So let me kind of step through that. So we're going to just simply multiply use the first example is really easy, the territory 1 workload by 1,000. So we're going to have 1,000. And then in this bottom table, there's a weighting of 50. So it's 500 index points. Very simple, right? And then the potential is actually, it was a little higher because it was 1.02 index value. So multiply by 1,000, multiply by 50%, and you have 508. So the net result here is that the index of territory 1 is pretty much balanced. It's 1,008. So it's a very balanced territory. Territory 2 is a bit higher, 1,327. We'd probably want to do some work to bring that one down a little. In territory 3, the 665, it's kind of low. We'd want to give it more accounts so it has more sales potential and more workload. So that's really how you get to the index. The other point here is that the index is going to change, obviously, as you change the weightings or as you change the parameters that go in. So in the top example, I went ahead and used sales. So weighted workload and potential a little bit less, and then added historical sales as a third parameter to come up with our index. And you can see when you compare the top table and the bottom table that the index values obviously are going to change a little bit. So I think the important point on this step is that there's not a right answer here per se. This is really all about determining for your business, and Nabil kind of touched on this in the very beginning, how your sellers work and what their role is like and the activities they have to do to be successful, mapping that back to how are these metrics going to be a good measure of the effort they're going to need to put in their territory, and then what's the right balance. And this is something that your sales leadership and those who really understand how the work that gets done in the field are going to have the best input into. And then I did say come back to historical sales. What I've seen in the past is this is most relevant if you have a fairly mature product, right? And so you're not highly saturated in one market and low in another, because if that's the case and you use sales, just historical sales as an input, you're going to kind of wash out the fact that this highly saturated market has a lot less incremental sales potential than the low saturation market. So that's where just understanding the business context would direct you. Does it make sense to include historical sales at all or not? Okay. So hopefully that makes sense, kind of how we got over here to the index value and some of the considerations. And then what you would do as far as the process is go through, make changes to the territories. And as you updated the underlying accounts in a territory, the index value is going to go up and down. So let me jump to the next page because it kind of ties this together and how it works in practice. Get my other screen here. Okay. So on this page, what we're looking at on the right-hand side is a chart of when you take all the territories and you line them up in order of lowest to highest index value. Okay, so on the left-hand side of this chart, there's a few of these territories circled. and the line that has kind of the tails that go down and go up, this is kind of the before view. And then there's a flatter line. I know the colors might be a little hard to differentiate, but the key thing is to see that there's some dots here that are inside kind of our bounds. There's some dots here that are inside. The middle of this curve is pretty much the same, right, in both scenarios, the before and after. The edges are what really are important here. So these territories are going to have insufficient workload, presumably not a lot of sales potential. So the end effect is that the rep covering them is just going to be a lot harder to achieve their quota, right, if they don't have as much opportunity to pursue. Conversely, over here, these are, quote, I'd call them easier territories because there's a lot of sales potential. So this whole exercise, what we're trying to accomplish is to bring these down and give them an equitable amount of potential to the rest of the sales team, an equitable amount of workload, and bring these up. And the way you do that is by moving the accounts around that make up that territory. So kind of said another way, let me just run through the bullet points on the left here. Account or geography adds and drops from territories are what's going to flatten this curve out ultimately. And that is what is effectively a more balanced set of territories for the sales org. The other kind of quantitative way to think about is getting to the 1,000 points, per territory. And then the tails that I touched on is really the important part, because if you've never done this exercise or anything like it, you probably do have tails across a sales team, a similar set of sales reps. And so depending on the maturity of the org and such and the work you've done, the difference between before and after is going to be greater. But obviously, if you've never done this and you have tails like this, you're going to get a lot of benefit by balancing out the territories. The other point that I think is important around this topic of balancing territories is that the other sales effectiveness levers that you have, like comp plan design, are going to be more impactful when you have a balanced set of territories. Because if you think about applying a better comp plan to these territories, well, better if it's richer for the reps, you're probably just going to end up paying them more, but same deals are going to close because they're not going to chase everything. There's just too much work to chase. So anyways, if you can balance the territories, the other levers like comp plan design are going to be more impactful. One little side note I just wanted to call out, we didn't really talk about Salesforce sizing at all. Typically, that would be an exercise you would do before the territory balancing to actually have the most profitable coverage. But even if you haven't sized a Salesforce, this is still a useful exercise because you can balance the territories and it's all relative, the way that this process works. So that's really all I had on the topic. We'll take a look at questions here in a second, but this is essentially an optimization problem. We're trying to align sellers' capacity to the workload to effectively cover the territories. And kind of that just restates what I've touched on before. It's balancing out workload and potential. So I'll pause there, see if any of the Forma guys have comments, and then we'll take a look at what we've got in the Q&A with the last few minutes here. Let's see, I think that's the end on the presentation. Yep. Okay.
So, I mean, I think the last point you made, Elliot, is spot on. It's
I'll go back here.
All of this is a initial build out of the model. And the goal should be to get the most, simplistic version built and then continuously iterate and make every variable or every part of it a bit more predictive, see what it produces and then reapply it or re-update it for the following month, the following year, et cetera. And I know that we're wrapped up on time. So I just wanted to put this out there for the audience. I think, in going through I recently read something, and it was very impactful to me around the impact for, and I can share this out after for those that are interested. It's an interesting study. The impact of retention of information when you're doing something versus just hearing it is orders of magnitude. It's so significant that you might as well kind of constantly partake in actually exercising it and practicing. And so one of the things that we're considering is as we dive deeper into these things is potentially having a session where we effectively go through and there's a little bit of echo, Elliot. So I don't know if
oh, sorry, I'll mute here. Yeah.
where we actually pick one of these topics and have a 60 to 90 minute session where we actually all kind of go through an exercise of building out a first version. Aside from the shameless plug of this is what we do at Forma, and this is part of our goal is to implement these models into the actual process so that you're able to leverage this as a part of your sales comp operations and process. But you could use the most basic of tools, Excel, to actually do this and get some decent results. And then obviously, as you want to scale it up and build it out, you can also use tools like custom building scripts and kind of iterating on that. But I think just understanding the framework will help you go a long way in how you think about the design. So if that's of interest, please do let us know. I think it's something that might be a cool exercise to do. But I can't say enough the results and the impacts of implementing a more data-driven approach for every from the territory quotas to the understanding the behaviors and the correlations and then the incentives themselves. But I believe we've answered all the questions that have come in so far. Anything else? Happy to use the remaining few minutes to answer any other questions that have come up. Okay. Well, I think with that, thank you everyone for joining and all the great contributions to the discussion. And please do reach out. I would love the feedback on if the audience thinks it would be a worthwhile exercise to have a more hands-on kind of practical exercise that we did as a group. And as Britt mentioned in the chat, please do sign up for the Nudge 2024 conference. I think we will have a great lineup of speakers and some very, I want to say, net new topics and discussion points that we want to bring up for the world of sales performance management. Awesome.
Cool. Thanks, Nabil. All right. I guess we'll drop the line. We're just about on time here. So
perfect.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.